They rolled up at dawn like they owned the sunlight. Delilah Thornberry and her spotless Escalade County officials, trailing like extras in a bad courtroom drama, a cease and desist clutched to her clipboard like it was a warrant. "Shut that well down within 48 hours, she said, voice sugar and venom. "Cap it or we start fines 500 a day and they keep stacking." The diesel smell from the rig mixed with her perfume and morning dew, and I remember looking at my $12,000 wellhead and thinking, are you really about to mess with 3 generations of my family's lifeblood? My name's Samuel Caldwell. This 40 acres in Millbrook County, Texas has my grandfather's initials carved into the fence posts, literal history, not Etsy decor. Most nights I watch ESPN like the next guy, but for 3 years I buried myself in law books and county records and dusty deeds, not because I wanted to become a lawyer, but because when city councils start whispering development opportunities, your gut starts to feel like it's being pickpocketed. Call it paranoia, call it stubbornness, call it whatever I call it, not letting my cows die thirsty because someone liked the idea of a manicured view. The drought last summer was a thing you could taste cows crowding around a pond that looked more like a map of its former self, ribs, showing where there should have been roundness. Meanwhile, the subdivisions kept sprinkling and the pools kept glinting in satellite photos like nothing was wrong. I dug through Dad's old papers and found a 1924 deed hand-scrawled ink browned with time guaranteeing perpetual subsurface water rights to Caldwell heirs. It smelled like old paper and tobacco and the answer to every petty threat. Jake Morrison, my high school buddy who went to law school because he liked arguing with people for money, whistled when he saw it. "This predates everything they can throw at you," he said. So we drilled. Acewell Drilling shows up their rig clangs like a salvation hymn, and I watch the rig bite into the ground while Delilah steps out of her car like she just left a magazine cover. Designer blazer hair that would have cost more than my feed bill heels sinking into clay she couldn't name. She ruled Pine Haven Estates like it was a fiefdom, and now that her political career had run out of steam, she'd turned HOA presidential power into a subscription service for spite. "Cease and desist," she said, thrusting a folder like a paper sword. "You're violating covenants industrial noise resource extraction without approval. 48 hours. I flipped through her stack and almost laughed. "This is agricultural land," I told her, pre-existing water rights county permit state exemptions. Her face went from polite to that kind of contorted disbelief people get when an expectation runs headfirst into reality. "We'll file liens for unpaid assessments," she hissed. "We'll collect. And legal fees you'll pay." She leaned in close and I could smell the floor wax of entitlement. She wasn't just pointing at me, she was pointing at a whole way of life she wanted gone. Delilah had done this before. She'd lawyered, levied, and litigated neighbors out of their farms, and she believed the courts and the zoning folks would back her because that's how a system built on paperwork and power tends to behave. But she didn't know I'd spent 3 years learning the weird little legal margins that blindside bullies. She didn't know what I found in Dad's attic. She didn't know I'd already called hydrologists and county record clerks and the people who stamp things official for a living. The escalation came fast. Jake pulled into my drive like a stampede, legal papers fluttering, sweat on his brow, even though the morning was cool. Delilah filed emergency motions claiming my well was commercial extraction without environmental review, and she had 3 board members ready to testify. Emergency hearing. Judge Hartwell presiding the judge, who, by the way, owned rentals in Pine Haven Estates. Stacked deck or so it seemed. Thing is, when they throw process at you to drown you, you drown them with better process. I pulled out Dr. Sarah Palmer's hydrological survey. She'd done an aquifer study years earlier, and it showed clearly that my well pulled from a formation 43 feet below the one feeding Pine Haven Estates. No overlap, no harm. I had county drilling permits, an agricultural exemption certificate, and that 1924 deed that read like a small, stubborn law book. Then Danny Cousin and records guy handed over county files showing the developer had pumped 2.3 million gallons during construction and never filed an environmental assessment. They'd sipped and landscaped and filled and never asked permission for the very thing they accused me of. Judge Hartwell's eyebrows went from bored to interested faster than I could finish my sentence. The emergency injunction got denied, Delilah's briefcase snapped shut like a gunshot, and for 2 brief shining minutes it felt like vindication. But you don't embarrass somebody like Delilah and expect her to go away. You just make her angrier and more creative. Within days, she mailed a special assessment to every household emergency legal defense fund, $2,847 per house due in 30 days. Suddenly, neighbors were getting bills for her failed lawsuit with their own money. Classic move, make the community fund your vendetta and watch the mob do your work for you. Phones lit up. Tom Patterson called crying his wife had panic attacks. They could barely pay the mortgage. Betty Morse, the widowed neighbor, called because she'd been threatened with a lien. Within a couple days, I had 15 families on my porch, scared and furious and starting to listen in a way they hadn't before. That's when Delilah started weaponizing bureaucracy, anonymous complaints, a county health inspector awkwardly showing up with a testing kit, EPA letters, TCEQ, inquiries, the whole orchestra of officialdom. It was a strategy: create suspicion, trigger tests, leak to media, then point at the tests and say, "See problem." Good news. I'd been taking weekly water samples since day one and keeping meticulous records. Livestock health logs, lab results. Everything you'd want to show if someone decided to play accuse and smear. When the inspector processed her samples, they came back cleaner than municipal tap water. The county health department recommended my well for drought relief. The local paper had to run a correction. The attempt to make me a pariah bounced off like rain on a barn roof. Delilah's counterpunch, though, was darker. She'd annexed properties. My cousin Danny unearthed original incorporation maps from 1987 with the Caldwell 40 explicitly excluded agricultural operations exempt from HOA authority. The 2023 annexation, filed by Delilah with no required notice to affected landowners. Illegal. Fraud. The realization hit like cold water. She'd been manufacturing jurisdiction to seize leverage, to harass, to force sales. Henderson's, Murphy's, and others had already been pushed out under the same false pretense. There's a delicious kind of clarity when a pattern becomes a conspiracy on paper. Tom spread bank records that smelled faintly of desperation, HOA funds used for private investigators, legal fees, environmental consultants, all aimed at rural families. The arithmetic was ugly. Tens of thousands spent to manufacture crises and then collect fines and force compliance. Fraud under color of authority. Conspiracy to deprive property rights. Racketeering in suburban clothing. We built a case like a surgeon assembling instruments. Jake called federal prosecutors. Tom organized the families. Betty did media outreach. Dr. Mitchell, the environmental consultant Delilah had hired, quietly said, "My water quality exceeded every standard, and ethically she had to tell me before submitting her report." Talk about irony, she paid for the assessment that proved me clean. The big play was the HOA annual meeting. Delilah thought she could control the crowd. She scheduled the meeting early, hired private security, moved the venue, bought tactical theater. We flipped the script. We booked projection equipment, set up cameras, printed the original boundary maps, prepared the financial spreadsheets, and alerted federal investigators. I installed cameras around the community center so if intimidation happened, it would be recorded. Saturday came and the clubhouse looked like a set for a showdown. Delilah mounted her podium like history owed her respect and started her spiel about community health. I stood up and asked a point of order. Shouldn't we address whether she actually had jurisdiction over agricultural properties? The room went still enough to hear a fly. That silence became a roar when Special Agent Catherine Walsh of the FBI walked in and said the words, "You hope never to hear in a fight like this. This is now part of an active federal investigation." Delilah tried to scream victim. She started building a perjury case against herself, admitting she'd spent HOA funds fighting neighbors, describing eliminating farms as if property ownership were a nuisance ordinance. She pointed at me and hissed that I was poisoning groundwater, while every test, every impartial report, and every paid-for assessment said otherwise. Then she finally admitted in a moment she could never take back that she wanted the farms gone, all of them forever. Handcuffs are ugly poetry. The click was the kind of punctuation you either hear in novels or in your life if you're lucky enough to see a bully get caught. Federal charges followed: conspiracy, fraud, deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The meeting continued under federal oversight, and what followed was the slow, satisfying unspooling of restitution and reform. 6 months later, the Hendersons got their farm back. The Murphys returned or were compensated. Delilah pled guilty and was ordered to repay over $600,000 in restitution and penalties, money she'd spent trying to erase what she hated. The association reconstituted its board. Tom became president and rewrote bylaws to explicitly protect agricultural property and require clear consent for any boundary changes. We started a drought relief cooperative around my well. Dr. Mitchell's report became teaching material about scientific ethics. Jake built a niche legal practice defending rural landowners, a heck of a comeback story from a bunch of angry neighbors and a pile of dusty documents. What I learned, the thing that slid into me like sunlight after a long storm, is simple and bitter, and human power left unchecked gets sloppy with morality, and systems built to manage rights can be twisted into weapons. But documentation, community, and a willingness to learn the rules can turn that weapon back on the wielder. Justice wasn't an abstract. It was paperwork, testimony, neighbors showing up, in a county archive that smelled like old paper and truth. The moral didn't arrive as a sermon, it settled in like a bruise you notice later. Protect what matters. Read the boring bits. Talk to your cousins who work records. Don't assume civility is a wall, sometimes it's just wallpaper hiding rot. And when your neighbor's life is on the line, your voice matters more than you think. The last thing I remember that night after the federal folks packed up and the crowd dispersed into the cool Texas dark was standing in my pasture, listening to water running in pipes, cows slobbering at troughs, and the soft murmur of people planning a barbecue instead of subpoenas. The farms were still here. The community, bruised but wiser, started to breathe again. So what would you do if your HOA came for the one thing keeping your family alive? When does community protection turn into abuse of power? And who watches the watchman? Drop your wildest HOA nightmare or your hard-won victory below. Tell us what you think is justice, what feels like revenge, and if you've ever had to fight the kind of petty paper-built tyranny that almost stole a way of life. I read every comment.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.